Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be talking about recording and mixing an electric guitar using plug-in amp simulators and effects that run inside of Pro Tools or really any DAW. Along the way I'm going to talk about some issues that can come up when you're trying to record an electric guitar with plugins inserted on your signal chain. I'll show you how you can set up Pro Tools and some settings and parameters and things like that that you can adjust to make the recording aspect of it go better. And I'll show you how you can change those around so that when you're mixing, your mixing goes more efficient as well too. I'm going to be using this Line 6 Variax 700 guitar. It's a modeling guitar, but the things I'm going to be talking about can pretty much go for any electric guitar. I'm going to record this clean into Pro Tools with no amps or effects or anything between my guitar and the interface. It's just going to be the clean electric guitar sound. So as long as you can record your guitar, whatever kind of guitar it is, plugged straight into your interface, all these things should apply to your kind of recording setup too. So let's get started. I'm going to be using this Pro Tools session. I've been using it for the past couple videos. It's basically for a simple pop rock song. It's got some acoustic drums, some electric guitars, a bass, and acoustic guitars. There's not much to it. I'm going to be recording the rhythm electric guitar parts in this video. Let me show you what my guitar sounds like. This is clean with no effects on it. Now while I'm recording, I think that I will get a better guitar performance if I have the guitar sound more like what it would be in the mix. So like if it has some amp simulators on it or things like that to make it sound more realistic to what I'm used to a guitar sounding like when I'm playing it through an amp, whether it be live or in the studio or whatever. But in this case, I want to record my guitar clean because I want to be able to adjust all those amp sounds after the recording rather than having to commit to having a particular amp sound while I'm recording it the first time. Some things you need to know is that in order to do that, you need to insert a effect plugin on this channel right here that you're recording. What this is going to do is the computer is going to take in your clean guitar signal and it's going to have to process it. And it's going to take a specific amount of time in order to do that processing. So the signal that you hear is going to be delayed by a little bit. And that's a problem. If you're not really sure what this whole latency thing is about and you've ever tried to record with plugin effects on your channel, you're probably like, why is there such a long delay? I hate this. I can't record like this. However, there's some things that you can do so that you can kind of get around the problem of latency. So the first thing that I've done is all these other channels, the bass, electric guitar, acoustic guitar, I've made these inactive. The reason why I've done that is I have all these plugins already set up on the channels, and they're taking up a lot of processing by my CPU when I have them active. And so what that means is that my computer has to do a lot of work to do all that processing in order to play those tracks back. So what I want to do when I'm recording, especially when I have an insert effect going, is I want to run my computer at as low of latency as possible. And the way that you control that is to go to Setup in Pro Tools and go to Playback Engine. Okay? And the hardware buffer size determines how much latency is going to go on inside of the computer. So here are the settings. I'm running my session at 48 kilohertz as a sampling rate. So the hardware buffer size I have is anywhere from 32 samples to 1024 samples. Now, when the computer has a buffer size of 32 samples, that means it's going to play back the sound after it processes the audio every 32 samples. So there's going to be a short amount of latency. However, when it has 1024, it's going to take that many samples of processing before the computer will play back the audio. So The reason why there are these different settings is when you have it set on 32 samples, that's when you get your low latency. However, it takes more CPU processing power in order to do all the multiplications, the additions, and things like that that go into processing when you run it at 32 samples. However, when you go to 1024 samples, your computer can process things more efficiently. And so when you have it on this setting, you can run more plugins at the same time. However, it's the kind of trade-off that you get is there's more latency in what you're playing back. So when you're recording, it's better to have a low number of samples in your hardware buffer size. But when you're mixing, it doesn't make as much of a difference, so you can run it at a higher hardware buffer size. So what I'm going to do, because I'm recording right now, is I'm going to set mine at 32 samples. All right, so it takes a second for the computer to catch up, but now it's that, and now I'm running at 32 32 samples in my hardware buffer instead of 1024. The other thing I should talk about is right now I have it set on low latency monitoring. What that's going to do is whatever signal is going into my interface, it's going to go straight out to the headphones without any processing. And that's a problem. I mean, when I'm trying to record with a plugin inserted, it'll basically just bypass the plugin and I won't hear whatever effect I have running. You know, this is good if you're recording vocals or something like that and you're really worried about the fact that you don't want any latency to what the person's hearing. And so when you're recording something dry and you're fine with it being dry, recording using low latency monitoring is a good idea. However, in this particular situation, I want to have the computer do some of the processing, and I'm going to have to sacrifice the fact that I'm going to have to take in 32 samples of latency to buffer and process the plugin. And so that's the kind of trade-off that you have to make. So I'm going to turn off low latency monitoring, and now it's a little bit delayed, 32 samples delayed. Now what you can do is I'm going to make my first plugin active. All right, now the difference is when let me show you when you switch on low latency monitoring what happens. So it bypasses it. Now you're back to your clean signal. No matter what, even if you have this active, it'll always be bypassed. You can't unbypass it in low latency monitoring if you have the track record armed. I'm going to turn this off, and now it is no longer bypassed. Now, what I'm going to talk about here with the plugins is I'm going to demonstrate several different plugins that are available and how you can use them to kind of get that overdriven, distorted electric guitar sound in your signal chain while you're recording. Now you might not necessarily want to use these when you're mixing, but I would recommend that you kind of make the sacrifice that maybe it doesn't sound so good, but the way that I have it set up, it's not going to take a whole lot of computer resource processing power in order to run these plugins the way I have them set up. So what I'm going to do is go through a bunch of different plugins and show you how you can set them on kind of like a low processing mode that's good for recording. The first one I've got is the Sansamp plugin. I got it with the factory bundle from Pro Tools when I purchased my Pro Tools software. And let me show you what it sounds like. Bypass it. So this plugin, it doesn't take up a whole lot of CPU power when you're trying to record, so that helps you run at a lower buffer setting. I can run it at 32 samples of buffer and have no problems recording it. It doesn't sound that great. I probably wouldn't use it on my actual mix down, but it gets me close enough to make me think that, okay, I'm playing through a guitar amp. It has a little bit more sustain. It kind of smooths out the harsh attack on the clean signal. And it sort of sounds like a guitar amp. So I might be able to play a little bit of a better performance while I'm recording if I've got this plugin going than if I'm just recording with the guitar amp clean. So something to think about. You know, a lot of people, maybe you're not familiar with having to record with a particular kind of plugin that has low CPU, but then when you're mixing, you use one that has a, you know, it has higher quality settings or upsampling or oversampling and things like that that take up more CPU. And, you know, a lot of people, maybe you've neglected the Sansamp plugin that you picked up with the factory bundle when you got Pro Tools because you have other plugins that sound better, but it's a perfect one to use when you're just tracking. So I'm going to go bypass this one now, make it inactive. Next one I'm going to talk about, it's part of the Pod Farm series, Pod Farm 2 from line 6. Now, the full Pod Farm plugin is much larger and you have a lot more options. You have effects, you have different kind of signal chains, you can have 2 signal chains going at the same time and all this different kind of stuff. However, Pod Farm line 6 put in these elements plugins, and I think that they're perfect when you're just trying to track because these are low CPU plugins. You can run them at a really low hardware buffer sampling rate and not have to worry about your computer choking on it and having problems. So I just have this one pulled up, the Guitar Amps one, and there's ones for different other things too. The dynamics, those are compressors, and you have your stomp boxes and stuff like that. Okay, and basically you just have all the different guitar amps that you can pick from, and that's it in the plugin, and you have all the different cabinets too. And that's basically the whole plugin. You can control the input and the output gain, and that's really it. I'll play it back. Okay, so sounds sort of like a guitar amp. Hopefully, you know, it makes me think that I'm playing through a guitar amp. It may not be the full signal chain that I want when I'm mixing, but it at least gets me part of the way there for when I'm recording. So that's the one from that goes with Pod Farm from line 6. Let me talk about Guitar Rig 5, and this is from Native Instruments, and how you can kind of have it set up in kind of a low processing mode for when you're tracking. The main setting that you have on this plugin is this high and low. And I think what it does really is kind of some kind of oversampling, which is good for kind of saturation sounds. However, if you turn it on this, clicked it on, you can see that the CPU goes up higher. Now, depending on your computer, maybe you can track with a higher setting, maybe you can't. Maybe your computer can only handle the lower setting. And so those are things that you can look for in the different kind of plugins to set them up if your computer isn't that fast or things like that. Kind of the trade-offs that you can do for tracking, but then when you're mixing, you can kick it into the high quality setting and get away with it because you have a higher hardware buffer setting. So running it in the low one is what you can do. Also, I pretty much have a basic signal chain, just a guitar amp and a cabinet. I haven't inserted any of these other kinds of effects, and all these other kinds of effects are just going to add to the CPU processing. So I've just been using this one. I'll play it back. So sort of sounds like a guitar amp, right? It's pretty good. I've also just used this matched cabinet, and there are more different options for the cabinets when you are using Guitar Rig 5. Later on, I'll get into these, but each of these other ones they kind of take up more CPU processing. So that's why when I'm tracking, the match cabinet is probably the lowest CPU one. So that's why I'm running with this one. But later on, I'll switch over to the more interesting kind of cabinets, modules that are in Guitar Rig 5. So that's that plugin that I'm going to show you. Next, I want to show you the DigiDesign 11 free plugin. So this is a light version of the full 11 plugin. I'm going to show you the full 11 plugin later on, but the free one, I think it came with some version of Pro Tools that I got, either Pro Tools 8 or something like that. And it just has 2 amps, a modern overdrive and a vintage crunch, has 2 cabinets. You don't really even have a choice of mics or anything like that. You just get what you've got, and that's it. But again, it's another plugin that has low CPU processing. This is a little bit more than some of the other ones that I've been showing you. But you know, it's still probably less than the full 11 plugin because it doesn't have all those different features and kind of things like that that are going on. The next one I'll show you is Amplitude Three. This is from IK Multimedia. And it has a lot more settings inside of it that you can select. I'm using the an amp from the Fender expansion pack that you can get with it. The first thing to notice is right away, similar to Guitar Rig, it has kind of like these global settings like eco and mid and high, and those are going to affect the quality of the simulations that are going on. However, so the highest one is going to be obviously the highest quality sounding, but it's going to take up more CPU power. So when you're tracking, the main thing is you kind of have to sacrifice sound quality in order to have better CPU processing. So that's why I've got it set on the lowest setting here, the Eco one. There's also, if you go into preferences, some things that you can set. All these sorts of things like oversampling, high resolution, cabinet resolution. I've set all these things on low or turned them all off because the main thing that I want is less processing, and all this kind of oversampling is just going to add to the processing for when I'm tracking. So those are just things that you can, preferences and things you can set inside of this plugin. I'll play it back. Alright, so that's what I wanted to show you in Amplitude 3. The next is I want to show you the Wavez Gtr plugin. And this one's sort of similar to the Pod Farm one in the sense that it has a lot of these individual plugins that come as part of it that right now I'm just using the Gtr Amp plugin. So there's a full tool rack, which I'll show you later on, which has a lot more settings and options where you can run stomp boxes and effects and multiple amps all at the same time, things like that. And then you have these other ones where you have different number of stomp boxes that you can run. And obviously the reason why they give you these ones, 6, 4, 2, things like that, is so that they all run different they all take up different amounts of CPU processing. So you have a 2 cabinet one for the amps. That's just the amps. You don't have to worry about the processing for stomp boxes or anything like that. I have probably the lowest drain on the CPU of the plugins, and that's just the Gtr Amp one. And I just have one of the amps called up. All right, I haven't really, I just pull up one of the amps, pull up one of the cabinets. And the whole point of recording like this is not to record some kind of signal initially in the signal chain. You don't want to record the amp because you want to be able to pick and choose your amp when you're mixing the full song based on what fits better with the song rather than having to commit to this particular amp and cabinet and microphone and all those things, if you do that initially, then you're stuck with that. You can't change that around after the fact. So the whole point is not to commit to a particular sound. And so it doesn't really matter, necessarily how good your amp simulation sounds while you're recording, just so that it's good enough that you can get a decent performance down. All right. So those are all the different amp simulator plugins I wanted to show you for when you're tracking. I'm going to use this one right here. I liked the Supersonic Amp from IK Multimedia. I think that was kind of unique. All right, again, just to show you, I've got it set 32 samples, and I've turned off low latency monitoring, and I've got one plugin running, and that's it. I've got the click, I guess, running too, and I've got my drums going. And next, I'm going to record just the introduction part of this song, and then I'll start mixing it. Here we go. Alright, so that's just the intro part. Nothing really fancy going on there. I've got the drums and guitar going, and that's it. What I'm actually going to do now is disable the recording. I'm going to bypass this one, make it inactive. So I'll play it back, and you can just hear all that's been recorded so far is a clean sound. So that's just the clean sound that was recorded. The plugin that was going was just processing that sound, but actually what went down in Pro Tools that was recorded was just the clean sound. There was no amp simulation on it or anything like that, no effects. So now I can go in after the fact now, use these kinds of plugins that are going to add in the different kinds of amps I want and stuff like that, and hopefully get it going, sounding better in my mix. So I've already went ahead and actually brought up, I'm going to open some of these plugins channels that I've got going. And let me talk about what I've got here. I took one of each of these plugins basically, and I've got them each on a separate auxiliary channel. I'm going to make these active. Oops, before I do that, I know that if I don't switch now to the hardware buffer setting, a larger hardware buffer setting, I make all these active, my computer is probably going to have trouble doing all that processing. So I'm going to go ahead, switch now because I'm done recording. I'm going to switch the hardware buffer size from 32 samples to 1024 samples. Now in this case, sorry, I'm going to turn this back on. Low latency monitoring, because when I was talking there's such a delay in my headphones that I was talking slowly because of having to make up for the delay. Anyway, now that I'm going to make these active, and while I'm recording, I don't have to worry about, or while I'm mixing, now I don't have to worry about my computer, the latency that it introduces with the mixing, because it introduces a latency uniformly across all the different tracks. So that's fine, and it can use that extra amount of buffer time to be more efficient with its calculations. So I've got on each of these auxiliary tracks a different plugin, similar to what I had here. What I'm going to do is route this track, this clean track. I'm going to route it out to all these different amp simulators I got Pod Farm 2, Guitar Rig 11, Amplitude 3, Waves GTR, and then I have this other one, the CLA Guitars, and I'll get to that one later on because it has some amp simulator stuff built into it, and I'm going to show you that. Now, just to remain consistent, I know that there are a lot of demos of amp simulator plugins on YouTube that you can check out and hear what the different ones sound like. What I wanted to do is also, I'll show you what it might sound like if it were being mixed. So I've got a bunch of plugins over here, and all of these tracks, each of them are going to go into this mixing one. And it'd be the same if I basically just put all these inserts on these auxiliary tracks, like if I was just mixing it that way. But what I've done here is kind of set it up so I can demo each one of these separately next to each other in parallel, and they're all going to go through this same kind of processing chain. And I can kind of hear how they're different, but it's kind of like the way I've set it up, kind of how I would compress it, how I would EQ it, stuff like that if I were doing it in a full song. So I guess the first thing I'll do is just play it back, and you can hear the Pod Farm plugin and what this is like, and I'll talk you through it. Here we go. Alright, so I've got the Pod Farm plugin going right here. All the other ones are muted, so you're not hearing those. I got the Pod Farm going into Kramer Tape, and I'm using this plugin right here, the Kramer Tape one. It's from Wavez. Basically, I got it set on the slower speed, 7.5 inches per second rather than 15, because what this one does is kind of boost the low end just a little bit and roll off some of the high end. A common problem among a lot of different amp simulator plugins is that the top end sounds a little bit harsh or a little bit brittle. So by using this kind of plugin, Tape is known for taking away some of that high end harshness. It sounds very smooth in the high end, so that's why I'm using this plugin right away. Just got a little bit of that tape compression going, and that's really it. It's going to be applied to all the different amp sims I got going. Then I got the NLS channel. I'm using the mic EMI desk. I've got the drive up a little bit. I think that this desk, similarly to the Kramer Tape plugin, it smooths out the high end, and I'll show you all this stuff as I go along too, what it sounds like if I bypass it and stuff like that. Then I've got an 1176 model. This is the Bomb Factory one. Again, it comes with the Pro Tools. It comes with the Pro Tools factory bundle. This is 1176 fast attack, fast release. I'm just doing the slightest amount of gain reduction on it when I'm mixing. What this is going to do is just compress the attack on the plugin ever so slightly, or the attack on the guitar performance ever so slightly. Then I've got the LA 3A. That's from Bomb Factory. And what this one's going to do is kind of compress by smoothing out the whole performance rather than just working on the transient of each hit of the strings. This one's going to compress the whole signal. Then I've got the HEQ, and what this is going to do is I have it set up to roll out a lot of the low end, around 161 hertz. I'm using a high pass filter there because typically when I'm in a mix, what I want to do is cut out all the frequencies down here in things like electric guitars, vocals, piano, stuff like that, so that my bass guitar and my kick drum can kind of occupy the lower frequencies below about 160 hertz. Got a little bit of a boost here around 250. I'm cutting around in the 400 range, in the mid range. I'm boosting a little bit about 1200, boosting a little bit about 3000 or a little bit less than that. And I'm using, in this case, what I really like about the HEQ is it has all these different, I'll show you here, these different kind of curves that you can use. And they're all a little bit different. You can use them for different kind of stuff. I really like the digital ones because they have these kind of, when you boost in one place, you kind of scoop in another place. So that's what's going on here. You can see how the shape changes depending on your Q setting here. Then I'm using a high pass filter again, or a high shelf, excuse me, a high shelf to kind of take out again a little bit of the high end, decrease it here, and then I'm using a low pass filter to really take out everything above 10K, and that's with the digital kind of plugging in, and you can see how that changes the slope by changing the Q. So that's basically the signal processing chain here. Let me get back to Pod Farm 2 so you can see what I've got. Each of these plugins is a little bit different, and they have some things that I like about them that are unique, so I'm going to try and highlight the unique things about the plugin when I'm discussing it. So the Pod Farm plugin from line 6, the main thing that it has going for it is it has tons of guitar amps. So I'm just going to scroll through. These are just the guitar amps. It has tons of effects. It even has mic preamps, has bass cabinets, bass amps. It's a full suite of stuff. So if you're looking for like just a ton of different options and tons of different stuff, if you don't have like a whole, you're a lot of compressors and stuff like that you like to use, you don't have, chorus and vibrato effects and that kind of stuff. The Pod Farm plugin has tons of different stuff that you can use. Dynamics, those are compressors, distortion, so these are all kinds of different stomp boxes and stuff like that. It's got tons of different stuff in it. So probably the thing that Pod Farm has going for it is it has so many different options. Another, what I've got going here is I'm using kind of a matchless guitar amp that a lot of the other ones don't have. A lot of the other amp simulator plugins, they everybody has an AC30, everybody has a Marshall Plexi, everybody has a JCM 800 model, but not everybody has the matchless stuff, and those are pretty cool amps. So that's one thing I like about Pod Farm is the variety of amps. Now I'll show you the settings I've got going for this one. The thing that it doesn't have a whole lot of is microphones, so it just has 4 options. That's kind of the trade-off. It does have a fair amount of cabinets too, and I'm just using the cabinet that matches the amp head, but you can adjust all those and switch between whatever one you want to use. And that's really it. I'll play it back again so you can hear it, and maybe another thing that I'll do is add in a preamp. So apart from having these guitar amps, you can also add in like an API, an SSL, these different kinds of preamps. You have a Neve one over here, and shape the sound. Additionally, not only are you having a guitar amp, but you also have kind of a preamp going too. So I'll pull up the API. You can adjust the gain, stuff like that. I think is cool for them to model. Another downside of the Pod Farm plugin at this point, when I'm shooting this video, this plugin's been out a long time, and the amp simulation modeling has been around a long time too. And in fact, Line 6 has even come out with products like the Pod HD that have more advanced modeling built into it. So it's kind of an older generation modeling that they're using. So maybe it's not the most up-to-date modeling and highest quality of modeling, but you have so many options that those are the kind of trade-offs you get with this plugin. So I'll play it back and you can hear it. Alright, so that's the Pod Farm from Line 6. There's other cool things you can do with it. You can have dual tones going at the same time, so you have 2 signal chains. There's tons of different stuff you can add in, but that's not what I'm trying to focus really on in this tutorial. So let me get rid of this one. Next one I'm going to show you is Guitar Rig 5. And right now I brought up in it a Marshall Plexi model. And then I'm going to use this Control Room Pro. With the Marshall Plexi model, it's got basic controls on it. You can change around a lot of this different stuff. Then you also have advanced controls in Guitar Rig where you can mess around with things like the seg and bias and stuff like that if you're really into tweaking your guitar amp sounds. Then with the Control Room, there's all these different cabinets and stuff that you can select. I'll go through them a little bit so you can hear them. You have a couple different microphones too. Pretty good selection. Again, I don't want to go too much into depth with it. Then you have different selections of mic placement on the cabinet. Then what you can do is go in and into all these different places, pull up more cabinets and more microphones, basically run all those stuff in parallel. I'm just going to use one and demonstrate it, but you can be as creative as you want with this kind of stuff. And I haven't even gotten into all the other effects that you can do, compressors and stuff like that. So I'll play it back and you can hear this one. So some of the strengths that I like about Guitar Rig is, it doesn't have the same number of guitar amps, certainly as Pod Farm, but it has a good amount of cabinets, it has a good amount of microphones, and you have all these different places. The Control Room Pro is great because you can, have all these things in parallel, and you can kind of, blend them all together. You can pan them around. Maybe you want one cabinet on the left and one cabinet on the right and do all that kind of stuff. You can get really creative with it. And that's just, so far, the amp and cabinet kind of stuff that I talked about. The main thing that I think sets Guitar Rig apart from some of these other ones is I think that it's a full effects suite of plugins, not just amp simulation. It does a lot of these other things good too. And it has some great models of compressors that go along with it. So that you've got from Softtube and Native Instruments, you have 1176, you've got an LA2A, you've got DBX 160, all that kind of stuff. So that's the vintage compressor line that you can get, which I think is great. A lot of these other amp simulation plugins, whether it be Pod Farm, whether it be from Wavez or Amplitube, what they focus on, I think, is the amps and the cabinets, and then they kind of throw in these other effects just as an afterthought, like, okay, we'll just throw in a compressor. It's, whatever compressor we come up with, that's fine. But here, what's cool is you can, you've got an SSL compressor that's been modeled, which is, I think, a little bit might sound a little bit better and people might like to use. And so then it's not just about an amp simulation plugin, it can be used as a full effects suite. So those are the things that I think are cool about Guitar Rig 5. Another thing that's good is you can route things in any order you want at all. And the other ones, you're a little bit limited. Okay, you have to put the amp and cabinet here, and then you have the effects here, post and pre, and that's really all you can do. The routing is just crazy in this plugin for what you can accomplish. There's really the creativity. The sky's the limit. Whatever you want to do is basically possible, and I'm not even going into all the stuff with it. I just want to hit the main points. So the next one I'm going to show you is the full 11 plugin. This is from DigiDesign. Whereas before there was just a couple of amps, there's more here that are part of this plugin, and then you also have more cabinets. Another thing now compared to 11 free is you have different microphones down here. You can change between on-axis and off-axis, so that's the direction the microphone is pointing at the cabinet. then you also can control speaker breakup. This is a pretty much, to me, a unique setting on this plugin compared to any of the other plugins. Don't really have this kind of speaker breakup the same way that DigiDesign does. However, some people I think will like it. I actually find that I never like to use it, and so having this feature, you know, to me it's not a selling point because I don't even end up liking it most of the time. Anyway, I'll play this one back and you can hear it. Another thing that's cool I think about it is the amp selection. You know, it's got all the ones that you would expect. It has the AC30, it has the Fender Twin, stuff like that, and then also has these Soldano amps, which are pretty cool. A lot of other of the amp plugins just have one channel of this amp. Usually it's more the high gain kind of stuff because people like this amp for a lot of distortion and sounds that call for a lot of overdrive and gain. However, I like that this plugin has 3 different channels. It has the drive, it has a crunch, and it has a clean. So you can get I think that these amps sound great for clean stuff as well as overdrive. So the one I'm featuring here is a crunch channel, and I've really scaled back the overdrive so it's just a little bit of distortion going on just to dirty up the clean signal a little bit, ever so slightly. So here's what it sounds like. All right, so that's that one I want to discuss. Next, I'll talk about Amplitude Three. This is from IK Multimedia. You know, some of the things that I think are cool about it is it has a bunch of different amps that don't really show up in any of the other plugins. For instance, I picked up some of the Amplitude Slash ones. I picked up that pack. I think those are cool to have different kind of Marshall amps. And another thing that I really like is they've modeled a bunch of the different orange ones. So these other plugins just maybe have one orange amp modeled. This one's got a bunch that you can pick out and try your luck at, and I just picked up one. All right, I'm showing you one here, and I'll demonstrate it to you in a second. I want to make sure that I discuss with this one how I switched the settings back. So before, when I was recording, I had it on the eco mode. Now I'm up to high. Then I went into preferences down here, and I've got the stomps oversampling, all this oversampling up, cabinet resolution high, real ambience, real spring, all that kind of stuff is that's higher on the CPU now because I got all that stuff going on. But it's also going to produce a higher quality amp simulation, hopefully. Here's my cabinets that I've got. Cool thing is the microphone selection also. I think they've got some good microphones like the Sennheiser 441 instead of just the 421. Stuff like that's cool. I'm going to pan these out so you can hear one on the left, one on the right. And it also has a pretty good ambience, kind of like reverb that you can add in. I'm using the small studio here, just up a little bit. And that's really my whole signal chain inside of Amplitude. You can hear it now. All right, so that's a very unique sounding guitar amp. I think that's cool that IK Multimedia decided to put that in there. This is the Gtr Tool Rack from Wavez. What I was showing you first here was where you can insert stomp boxes at the beginning, stomp boxes post amp, and then here's your amps right now. I have 2 going, one on the left, one on the right. What's unique about this plugin versus some of the other ones is, again, that the amps that you can use. So what I had here, these are the ones that are very unique on the partnership that they did to kind of do Neil Citron's amps. I guess that's how you say his name. It's very unique compared to the other ones. I think that they still have, it's kind of difficult to tell which amps are which, but maybe like the edgies, maybe they're AC30 and stuff like that. You kind of have to guess which amps are which with theirs, because they don't have as identifiable of pictures. But another thing's cool is I like the Prs amps. Those are kind of very high gain amps, but you know, sometimes they work well. Let me play this one back and you can hear this. Again, it's a very different kind of amp sound. All right, that's how it sounds. One thing I'll just add in here quickly that I like to do is I like in this plugin how this kind of two things here I'm going to add in here that's pretty cool to show you the tone one, because it's very musical, very the way that I would typically EQ like I'm doing over here is roll out some of the low end, pull this back a couple dB, and pull back some of the high end around maybe 12K. And that kind of processing, you know, I like having that built into the plugin. That kind of EQ is great. Then it's got a compressor. Alright, so those are cool effects. Wavez is known for their effects, obviously, so you got to think that the ones that they put in there in this package are going to be pretty good. Same, you know, I think that the effects are another good aspect of the GTR package. Same with Guitar Rig 5. You know, that one's got really good effects. Last thing I want to talk about as far as plugins go is the CLA Guitars. This is part of the Chris Lord-Alge Signature Series plugins, and with this plugin, it's just meant to be an all-around guitar effects processing plugin. But what it has is it has some impulse responses of guitar amps that it's going to use. It has a clean one, a crunch one, a heavy one, and what you can do is kind of switch in and out the impulse responses, so you can have no amp simulation. Then you just have the EQs, compressors, the effects over here, reverb and delay that you can switch in and out. Or you can switch the amp in, and now you've got basically amp simulation going on along with these effects inside of the plugin. So if you're looking for something that's basically like an all-in-one sound guitar processing plugin, this one's great for it because it's got all these different kinds of things. Pitch, it's got really great sounding compressors, really great sounding smooth EQ curves right where you would want to, and you don't even have to worry about a lot of different kind of stuff like, all right, what frequency am I boosting, what frequency am I cutting? It's just right in the right spot for the guitar sounds. One of the drawbacks of this one is that you only really have 4 settings. You have a clean setting, a crunch setting, and a heavy setting, and a bypass one, which is really kind of no amp sound. You can't really control the gain. So I'll switch between them and you can hear them. The sound that I was going for this song, I think the crunch one has too much gain and the clean one doesn't have enough. So I really want something in the middle, but I'm kind of limited because there's no gain setting where you can you know, do more or less. You can sort of control it by the input and output fader, and so I'll play around with that, see if I can get something more usable, but here it goes and you can hear it. Here's a clean sound. Heavy. Sort of back up the gain this way. More gain. So that's a way that you can sort of, it's not a normal kind of gain knob that you're adjusting, but what it's doing, it's the equivalent of if you just roll back the volume on your guitar. If you're used to playing with an amp with distortion, by rolling back that volume, you're kind of clean up your guitar amp a little bit because you're not overdriving the input too much. So that's really the CLA plugin that I wanted to show you. I've backed off the low end a little bit. I boosted the high end. I'm using just a basic compressor setting. It's got this pitch effect that kind of widens out the stereo image, and that's really it. Let me show you what I'm doing here now with these plugins. I'll just, for the sake of, why don't I use the 11, this one right here. I'll use this sound, and I'll go through the plugins and show you what each of them's doing. I'll bypass all of them to begin with so you can hear it. Drums. So hopefully you can hear I'm rolling off some of the high end, just making it a little bit smoother from bypassed. Next up is NLS. Here's the different ones move. SSL. Here's the 1176 again, fast attack, fast release. So what this one's going to mainly do is smooth out the transients of the signal. I'm going to back off a little bit. So LA 3. This one's specifically to kind of clean up the low end, clean up the high end, boost where you would normally EQ an electric guitar. Play it again. And then I got the one knob just to kind of even out the levels. This really cleans up the low end and the high end. All right, so that's my electric guitar. Hopefully you got to hear a bunch of different amp simulator plugins, how they sound, and hopefully you got an idea about the different features, how you might want to set them up with parameters and settings for when you're recording, and then how you might want to change those parameters and settings around when you're mixing. Some of that comes in by picking the right plugin, whether you're picking the full like Pod Farm 2 plugin, or if you're just picking the individual like guitar amp plugin that doesn't have the same amount of CPU. So hopefully that gives you just an idea about recording and mixing electric guitars. And if you've run into problems with latency and stuff like that, ways that you can get around it and record and mix by maximizing those sorts of things like the hardware buffer size for whatever setting you're going for. What I'm going to do to finish things out is kind of bring in all the other instruments now. make these active. It'll just take a second, activating all these ones. And I'll play it back, kind of mixing the electric guitar to sit in the mix with the other stuff too. Thanks a lot for checking out the video, guys. Until next time, take care and check out some of the other videos if you want to see more how I record and stuff like that. Electric guitars, I have other videos, acoustic guitars and drums and stuff like that. So thanks a lot for checking out this video. I hope that it was helpful for you. Here's the full song now with more instruments. Take care, guys.